Samaria, Kingdom of Israel, 842 BC. A woman hears horses' hooves approaching the palace. She knows exactly what that sound means. General Jehu is coming to kill her. The hallways are already empty. The guards who swore to protect her vanished hours ago. The advisors who surrounded her for decades slipped out the back doors. She is completely alone. And she does something nobody expects. She walks to the mirror. She lines her eyes with kohl, the dark cosmetic worn by royalty across the ancient Near East. She fixes her hair. She puts on her jewelry piece by piece. And she walks to the highest window in the palace to wait. Her name became shorthand for betrayal, seduction, and evil. It shows up in songs, in books, on TV, and almost nobody using it has ever read the actual story. Most people know just 2 moments. She had a prophet who defied her, hunted down, and she stole the vineyard from an innocent man. But that's barely the surface. The ancient texts describe a woman who built and ran an entire machine of power, who controlled more than the king himself, and who came from a bloodline where religion and the throne had already been the same thing for generations. And there's a detail about how she died, tied to an image that shows up on real archaeological ivories, found hundreds of miles away, that almost nobody talks about. Hold on to that. We'll get there. Today, the word Jezebel has practically become an everyday word in English. It means dangerous woman, seductress, manipulator. It's one of the few names in the Bible that escaped Scripture entirely and became its own cultural shorthand. And most people using the word have never read a single line about who she actually was. Where did that reputation come from? And more importantly, is it fair? Or is it just the only version that survived because it's the only one anyone ever told? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. Not in Israel. Somewhere completely different, with a much older tradition of power. Sidon on the Mediterranean coast. The harbor is packed. Ships loaded with purple dye, glass, cedar wood. The air is full of different languages mixing together. Coins changing hands, seagulls. This is where Jezebel is born, daughter of Ethbal, king of Sidon. And her father's name alone hides an important clue. Ethbal literally means with Baal, a name that basically declares religious devotion from birth. But there's more. The historian Flavius Josephus, citing an old Phoenician chronicler named Menander of Ephesus, records something the biblical text never mentions directly. Ethbal wasn't born a king. He was a priest of the Astarte, the chief Phoenician goddess, before he seized the throne of Sidon in a coup against the previous king. That's an extra-biblical source, not independently confirmed. But if accurate, it completely changes how we should understand Jezebel. She didn't grow up in an ordinary court. She grew up in a family where religion and the throne had literally been the same thing. For the least a generation, to her, a priest becoming a king, or a queen directly running a kingdom's religious apparatus, wasn't a violation of anything. It was simply the world she'd been raised in. And the Phoenicians weren't just some minor people. They're the ones who created the alphabet that, with some changes, the entire world still uses today. They were sailors who crossed the whole Mediterranean, merchants who built trade networks across continents, builders who raised cities, long before most of their neighboring kingdoms even existed. Jezebel wasn't coming from some backwater. She was coming from a culture that was, in several ways, more sophisticated than the kingdom she was marrying into. When she marries Ahab, king of Israel, in a political alliance typical for the era, royal marriages sealed trade and military deals. They weren't about love. She isn't moving up in the world. From her point of view, it was probably the opposite. She was stepping down into a smaller horror kingdom that, in her eyes, was religiously behind the times. The normal pattern, diplomatically, at that time was the opposite of what Jezebel does. A foreign princess marrying out usually adapted to the customs and religion of the kingdom she was joining. That was the political price of sealing the alliance. When that didn't happen, the Bible treats it as a serious warning sign, not an exceptional courtesy. Decades later, King Solomon himself would be condemned by Scripture for letting his foreign wives bring their gods into Israel. Jezebel doesn't ask permission, and she doesn't settle for quiet, private devotion. She personally funds, out of the palace treasury, 450 priests of Baal and 400 priests of Asherah, 850 religious officials, fed at her own table, paid for by the royal treasury. For comparison, that's a religious power structure bigger than many small armies of the period. That alone would be remarkable, but there is a part of this story almost no popular summary ever mentions. While she was building that structure, she was also actively wiping out the competition. The biblical text records that Jezebel led a systematic purge against the prophets of Yahweh, Israel's God, killing them not as scattered violence, but as deliberate state policy. And the most revealing proof of that doesn't come from an enemy of hers. It comes from inside her own palace. A man named Obadiah, who ironically was the chief steward of King Ahab's own household, the highest-ranking official in the palace, was secretly a devoted follower of Yahweh. And at the height of Jezebel's purge, he hid 100 prophets in caves, in groups of 50, personally bringing them food and water, risking his own life to do it. Think about with that. The official closest to the king, inside the very palace where Jezebel lived, didn't trust her enough to protect 100 men of faith out in the open. He had to hide them in holes in the rock. That's not the picture of a queen who just brought her religion along. That's the picture of someone who controlled the machinery of the kingdom enough to generate real terror. Terror so serious that it forced a mass hiding operation inside the capital itself. There's a line, written even before the most famous episode of her life, that sums up everything we need to know. The biblical text itself says in no uncertain terms, "There was no one like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of God, incited by Jezebel, his wife." Incited by her. That's not a modern reading, not a loose interpretation. That's the plain description in the original text. The king of Israel is presented as the instrument of her will, not the other way around. That same dynamic shows up again, even more concretely, in the episode that comes next. The most famous story of her life. When Ahab gets depressed because he can't buy a piece of land, she doesn't ask permission, doesn't suggest, doesn't advise. She writes the official letters herself, in his name, sealed with the king's own royal seal, the highest instrument of authority in the kingdom, without needing him actively involved in a single step of the plan. And the text records the exact line she says to Ahab, practically mocking his inability to act. "Is it not you who now reigns over Israel? Get up, eat some food, and be cheerful. I'll get you the vindiv." Notice the tone. That's not a wife making a request. That's a ruler reminding the king what his job actually is. To understand the next confrontation, you need to know what came before it. 3 years of severe drought, which Elijah had prophesied as direct punishment for worshipping Baal, who was, among other things, the Phoenician god associated with the rain and the fertility of the land. In other words, the confrontation that's about to happen isn't just religious. It's literally my rain god against yours, with 3 years of real famine backing up the bet. At Mount Carmel, Elijah publicly challenges the 450 priests of Baal, the same ones supported at Jezebel's table, to prove their God actually answers. They fail, for hours, in front of a crowd. Elijah then calls down fire from heaven, publicly proves her gods are powerless, and orders the execution of all 450 priests, right there in a single day. This is a devastating religious and political victory. The biggest public blow Jezebel's power structure has ever taken. And it's at exactly this moment, at the height of Elijah's own power, that she does something that changes everything. She doesn't raise an army, she doesn't organize a religious cult attack. She sends a message. Simple, direct. In 24 hours, you'll be as dead as they are. And it works. The same man who wasn't afraid to face a king, an entire army of rival priests at a hostile crowd all by himself, runs into the desert, collapses emotionally, lies down under a tree, and asks to die. It wasn't an army that broke Elijah. After everything he'd already faced without flinching, it was one sentence. Written by her. Think about what that actually means. At a time when women, even queens, rarely had recognized direct power to act, Jezebel psychologically breaks the most feared man in the kingdom. A man who just won a public showdown against her own God, with a single message. Is that the portrait of a villain with no sense of limits, or of someone who understood power and intimidation better than anyone else around her? If that twist caught you off guard, drop a like right now. It genuinely helps YouTube understand this story deserves to reach more people. A man named Naboth owns a vineyard, family land passed down for generations, right next to the royal palace in Jezreel. King Ahab wants that land. It would make the perfect vegetable garden. He offers to buy it or trade it for better land elsewhere. Naboth refuses. Under Israelite law and tradition, family land wasn't for sale. It was sacred inheritance, tied to the ancient tribal laws of the territory. Ahab goes back to the palace defeated, depressed, and frees himself on his bed without eating, the same scene we already saw in Block 4. But now, let's see the whole plan, not just the outcome. Jezebel writes letters in the king's name, seals them with his royal seal, and sends them to the elders and nobles of Naboth's own city, using the kingdom's official government apparatus as a weapon. The instructions are precise. Proclaim a public fast, a solemn ritual, signaling something serious has happened in the community. Seat Naboth in a place of honor, in full view of everyone, and bring in 2 men willing to lie under oath, publicly accusing him of cursing God and the king, the one crime that, under the law of the time, justified immediate execution with no appeal. The elders of the city, Naboth's own neighbors, follow the written order without question. They stoned to death that same day. The vineyard passes into the king's hands. No army, no public violence traceable directly to her, no single visible mark that could be traced back to the palace except for the testimony of the biblical text itself. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold, bureaucratically perfect administration of power. The kind of political maneuver that, if a male king had pulled it off, would probably have a completely different name in the history books. And the divine response to this crime, delivered through Elijah once again, doesn't just punish Jezebel. It condemns Ahab's entire dynasty, decreeing that every male descendant of the bloodline would be wiped out, and that the bodies, hers included, would be devoured by dogs and birds with no proper burial. The Naboth case wasn't just one isolated crime. It was the trigger that sealed the end of the entire dynasty she had helped build. But here's something almost no popular retelling of Jezebel's story ever mentions. Her reach didn't stop at Israel's borders. 2 of her sons, Ahaziah and Joram, rule Israel one after the other, and one of her daughters, Athaliah, marries the king of the neighboring kingdom of Judah. That means that for a stretch of history, Jezebel's blood and direct influence sat on the thrones of both Hebrew kingdoms at the same time, something almost unheard of for a foreign-born princess. And her daughter Athaliah later does something even more shocking than anything we've covered in this video. So much so that some scholars believe she was directly inspired by her own mother's example. That's a completely different story, and it deserves a video all its own. If you want to make sure you don't miss it when we tell it, now is the time to hit subscribe. Back to where we were. It's precisely because of this web of power, 2 of her sons ruling neighboring thrones at the same time, that Jehu's rebellion, which we're about to see, doesn't just kill Jezebel. It kills her own son, king of Israel, and her grandson, king of Judah, in the very same military campaign. Jehu wasn't just seizing a throne. He was wiping out an entire dynasty built around the influence of one foreign woman. Then we're back where we started. Samaria, 842 BC. Jehu, the general who just killed both her son and her grandson in the same bloody uprising, advances on Jezreel to finish the job. Jezebel knows he's coming for her next. There's no army left to defend her, no ally willing to risk their life for her. So she does what she's always done her entire life. She doesn't back down. She dresses like a queen, walks to the highest window, and when Jehu finally appears below, she doesn't beg, doesn't hide. She fires off one last provocation. Was it peace for Zimri, who murdered his master? That line sounds simple, but it's a calculated strike. Zimri was a usurper decades earlier, who assassinated his own king, reigned for just 7 days, and ended up cornered, setting his own palace on fire rather than be taken alive. One of the shortest and most disgraceful reigns in Israel's history. By comparing Jehu to Zimri, Jezebel isn't just insulting him. She's publicly predicting, with whatever authority she has left, that his reign will end in the exact same disgrace and betrayal Zimri's did. It's the final power move of a woman with no army left, no allies, no hope of surviving that day. Nothing but words and a flat refusal to look defeated. Jehu doesn't answer with words. He orders her own servants to throw her out the window. And here's the archaeological detail I asked you to hold on to at the start. Archaeologists are found at several sites across the ancient Near East, including carved ivory pieces from Nimrud, hundreds of miles away, an image that shows up again and again in the arts of the period. Almost like a fixed symbol, a woman's face, framed in a window, links by many scholars to the goddess Astarte, the very goddess that, according to the traditions cited by Josephus, Jezebel's own father had served as priest before becoming king. There's no way to prove with absolute certainty that Jezebel knew that specific image, or was consciously recreating it, but some biblical scholars raise this possibility that her final gesture, the makeup, the jewelry, the royal posture, in a window, might not have been vanity at all. It might have been the last political and religious statement of a woman who, right to the end, never stopped being the daughter of a line of priest kings. When Jehu's men come to collect her body for a burial fit for a queen, hours later, the dogs have already eaten almost everything. All that's left is the skull, the feet, and the hands, exactly as Elijah had said years before. 2,800 years later, her name is still used to describe dangerous women. And after everything we've just seen, maybe that word is still exactly right. Because what the texts show isn't a woman wronged by a one-sided verdict. It's a woman who arrived in a kingdom that wasn't hers, and instead of adapting like she was expected to, tried to rebuild it in her own image, running the king from behind the scenes, funding an entire army of priests with money from the royal treasury, systematically hunting down the prophets of Israel's God, manipulating the law and the machinery of the kingdom to kill an innocent man without ever getting her own horns dirty. She didn't just want to survive in the palace. She wanted the throne, and underneath it all, she wanted the place that belonged to Israel's own God. She never backed down, never begged, and she died exactly the way she lived, head held high in her own window, staring down the man who came to kill her, with one last insult on her lips. History didn't wrong her. She was, with every bit of precision that word carries, one of the sharpest and most dangerous power players the Bible ever put on record. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't do the easy version of history. If this video was worth your time, drop a like. It's the signal that tells YouTube to put this in front of more people. And subscribe, because there's a lot more history like this coming. including that story about her daughter Athaliah that I promised you earlier in the video. Thanks for watching all the way through. See you in the next way.